Hello? Can everyone hear me okay? We good? Okay, well, I'll start off with some shilling for the Adam Smith Institute. The Adam Smith Institute is one of the world's leading think tanks, ranked first in the world among independent think tanks by the University of Pennsylvania. Independent, non-profit, and non-partisan, we work to promote free market neoliberal ideas through research, publishing, media outreach, and education. And we are here today. We are here today to talk about backing better builds. For far too long, the housing crisis has been a topic of conversation without enough supporting action. It seems to be a political landmine necessary to avoid at all costs. And at the same time, generations of Brits are being priced out of the housing market, and many, many more are stuck in homes that do not fit their needs. With so many conflicting interests in the housing debate, it has been difficult to determine what matters to homeowners and home seekers alike. This panel will investigate public attitudes towards house building, housing development, and solutions to the housing crisis we can all get behind. So I'm joined by a fantastic panel today. Anya Martin, Director of PricedOut, a volunteer-run organization campaigning for policies that make the housing system work better. Ben Everitt, Chair of the APPG for Housing Market and Housing Delivery. He's served as an MP for Milton Keynes North since the 2019 general election. Samuel Hughes, he is a research fellow at University of Oxford and is a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. And we are also joined by Alexander Crowley, who runs Just Build Homes. He's a founding partner of Shared Voice and also a former political director to Boris Johnson. So the format today, is I'll ask these guys to give a brief introductory statement, and then we'll then move to chaired questions, finish up with a Q&A, and then close with with closing remarks. So first of all, I'd like to ask Ben to kick things off.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, to be invited to be here as well, and to see so many familiar faces in the audience as well. Some friends from the council that I was on, some parliamentary friends, some friends from industry that I've made over the course of the last sort of year and a half in looking up at in setting up the APPG on housing markets and housing delivery. I set up the APPG essentially because something needs to be done in housing, and it needs to be done in a way that is as non-party political as possible. I'll be party political later, don't worry. But the introduction there mentioned that housing is a political landmine, and we've all been complicit in that. You know, we as MPs and councillors, we've been actively laying those landmines and then looping around and treading on them for decades. The problem with, to put it in a nutshell, with the housing market is that it doesn't act like a market. It doesn't have those normal market characteristics that we would expect. And so the purpose of the APPG is to try and unpick that and make some sensible, rational suggestions to the government about what we can do to get market forces operating in a way that they should do. So we're very much looking forward to making those recommendations, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the questions that come from you. You're obviously interested enough in housing and to come along today, and therefore, hopefully, will give me something to run on as well.
Thank you very much. Alex, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So I come at this from the perspective, from a sort of campaign perspective, if you like. I've spent time on elections. I've spent time in the commercial world trying to help developers make their case to local communities to approve their schemes. And I've learned a number of things from that about why our housing system is broken and why we are not delivering the homes that we need. I take it there's probably one or two councillors here today. Yeah, I know one because I spoke to him earlier. But a few others as well. So the councillors in this room will know that from your perspective, it seems like everybody hates development. And that is because the only people you ever hear from are people who hate development. But they do not represent the majority, as evidenced by numerous studies, including the one that the ASI and CT have done for this event. Time after time, going over a period of years, you see a majority of people in favour of development, and not just development in general, but development in their local areas. And the reason for that is very, very simple. The majority of people don't own their own home. So of course they're going to be in favour of housing development because they want to get on the housing ladder, but nobody speaks to them. Developers don't speak to them, and if there are any developers here today, I encourage you to do that because they will support you. And the organisation that I run, Just Build Homes, has shown that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But also local authorities can talk to supporters as well. And by mobilising people who want development, we can change the whole planning system, because everyone knows that the very sensible reforms that the government were talking about to planning, I think probably the meat of them isn't going to happen. I think there will be some elements that the new Secretary of State will take forward, but I think the really meaty elements will probably just disappear very quietly for obvious political reasons that I don't need to explain here. So our planning system will remain fundamentally the same over the next few years, and yet we still have a need to build many more homes than we are currently building. So how do we change that? Well, instead of trying to reform the system, I sort of advocate hacking the system, for want of a better phrase. It's optimized for people who don't want development. And look, homeowners have a right to be heard and have a right to influence what is built next to them or in their local communities, of course. But actually, I also say non-homeowners have an equal right to have an influence in that debate, and they're not going to go to a council meeting, as riveting as they are, as my councillor friends will no doubt attest. They're not going to go to the impossible planning portal, which if anyone has ever tried to look at a council planning portal, I mean, really, you leave it with tears in your eyes. I went on one recently where they gave you about 15 reasons to object to something, and at the bottom they said just a general support. Slightly biased there, I might suggest. So how else do you do it? Well, what Just Build Homes tries to do is go to those people where they are, contact them where they are, contact them online, sometimes even calling them up on the phone. People still use those apparently. And when we speak to people who are under 35, who don't own their own home, and we say, do you think we should have more housing? They say, well, yes, obviously. Would you like to have more housing built in your area? They say, yes, please. They say, most of the time, they say, where do I sign up? They don't sit there and say, oh, yes, but what about the parking? What about the height? And all the other issues. As important as they are, they just want to get that number up. And we believe, and I believe, that if we can include those people in the debate, then we can actually make something of a difference to the system as it is.
Thank you very much. Anya, over to you.
Thank you. How's the sound? Good. I'm Anya. I'm from PricedOut, which is the campaign for affordable housing in England. And we campaign for everyone who is priced out of the home that they need, where they want to live, whether they be renters or whether they be first-time buyers. To kind of set the context a bit, we have a housing crisis, and that crisis is a crisis of affordability. Housing is quite simply too expensive. So we know that real house prices have risen by 400% since 1970. And that compares to an OECD average of 100%. So we really do have a uniquely fast growth here. Rents, which are an even better measure of housing affordability, because they don't directly factor in things like interest rates, have also risen. So as an example that I really like, I discovered that in 1995, the average 4-bed in Southwark went for about £1,800 a month in today's prices. And when I looked on Rightmove a few weeks ago now, I discovered that the cheapest 4-bed property in Southwark available was £2,500, and the average was closer to £2,800. That's a full £1,000 a month more. And that difference is almost an entire monthly salary if you're on minimum wage, let alone the full cost. So obviously people simply can't afford this. There are areas of the country where if you do not have family wealth to help you, you cannot afford to have children, you cannot afford to start a family, which is a serious, serious social problem. And this affordability issue then leads on to all of the other crises we have. So it leads into rising homelessness, it leads into falling home ownership amongst young people. It leads into a difficulty saving for retirement, for young people's futures. It leads into rising housing benefit, and that's only going to keep getting worse. And it also forces people to share into their 30s and even 40s sometimes now. And it also leads into all of the other housing issues that we face, like poor conditions in the private rented sector, because quite simply landlords do not have to compete in order to get tenants, because the demand is so high. The cause of that is quite simply and quite obviously we do not build enough homes in this country, and we have failed to do so for at least the last 50 years and probably longer. Now, there are obviously many factors that determine the cost of housing, things like interest rates as well, but there is overwhelming consensus that there is a shortage of housing in this country. Glenn Bramley, in a study for Crisis, estimated that shortage in England to be about 4 million homes. Create Streets, the campaign group, also highlighted that our housing stock has grown 40% slower than the European average. To put it in more technical terms, we have a real bad issue with price elasticity of supply. We do not build enough homes in response to rising prices, and we do so very poorly compared to comparator nations. Why? Well, obviously there are a lot of factors involved in these things, and as I've mentioned, interest rates already, they're more or less global. What we differ in is our planning system, the rules about where and when you can build housing. Essentially what we do is we have a default assumption in our planning system that you cannot build. And then in order to get to that permission, you need to go through a process which often takes years, which requires you to jump through loads of hoops which are often contradictory. You then, even if you meet all of the local planning policies, you're at risk of being refused permission anyway if the locals manage to launch a large enough campaign. You may have to go to appeal in order to win that permission. So it's very, very slow, it's very, very risky. And that is not reflected in other countries, right? We are particularly bad for this. So it kind of prevents house building where people want to live specifically. It does little to achieve any of the goals for which it was established. It doesn't encourage sustainability because actually it's easier to build far away from other people because you get less backlash. So it doesn't kind of meet any of the ambitions it was supposed to do. So why is it so hard to reform planning, right? Because there's pretty enormous consensus, as I've suggested, amongst economists and people looking at this problem, that we have an issue with planning and the planning needs to be reformed if we're going to fix the affordability problems and all of the other problems that stem from it. And I think it's worth understanding the reason that I've alluded to already for why they were established. They were implemented to address the externalities, the negative impacts of development on communities nearby. So the example that I always give is, imagine if you have a house in a sleepy village and someone wants to build an abattoir next to you. You're not going to be happy about it. And you might believe, and many people would be inclined to agree, that that abattoir should be placed further down the road, away from human habitation, where it's not going to upset people. So these systems are introduced for a good reason, right? It's not that we shouldn't have one. But the key flaw in it is that the benefits of house building are widely dispersed. They improve affordability of housing for people across a wide area, for people that don't live there yet necessarily. But all of the downsides of house building are very concentrated in the immediate neighbours: noise, dust, pressure on amenities, and so on. So you're kind of placing these two opposing interests against each other, and then you have a system that very much favours the latter. By definition, locals already have a home in the area, they can already afford it. And then they can obviously pressure politicians, and at the lower levels of governance, this can have electoral implications. So this stacks up into our chronic undersupply of housing, and it makes it very hard to reform because it's designed to consult people who don't want it, by definition. And also the geographic level of decision making. It tends to favour politicians not having an incentive to want to approve housing because they might get whomped, but they don't take much of the benefit for it. So that kind of sets out the problem and why it's so hard to achieve it, and then I'm going to leave you there and we can talk about the solutions in a bit.
Thank you very much, Anya. I know to my panelists at the start, I did say we can stand further back from the mics, and that would be fine. But apparently it's not fine. So if we could sort of try and maintain a medium distance from the microphone.
I'm notoriously bad at this, actually.
I think right there is fine. Anyway,
hold my position.
Over to you, Samuel.
Thanks. So I'm actually just going to give a less sophisticated version of what Anya just said. What the core problem is, the housing shortage is in some respects an extremely complicated issue, but in other respects actually quite a simple issue. The story behind it is this. In the 1940s, this country nationalizes the right to build. So prior to that, you had, by default, the right to build on your land. Subsequent to that, by default, you don't have it, and you apply for permission to do it from elected local government. That's not a crazy change. That was a system introduced for many good reasons that Anya has outlined. But the issue that arises is the following. So local communities, the people next to whom development is happening, suffer all of the inconvenience of development. They suffer construction work going on next to them for 2 years and whatever the loss of light and amenity, and the potential pressures on infrastructure and local services and so on, and generally the sense of risk that comes with change. It's quite widespread in these issues. And they gain very few of the benefits. So it is no surprise at all that they often kick up a vigorous fuss about this and you get a lot of opposition. And that's been a theme of planning discourse in this country for decades. Now, the answer we sometimes get from pro-development, pro-reform people, among whom I number myself, is, okay, we've got to smash the NIMBYs and crush the boomers. The victory of the pro-development forces, this is a zero-sum battle between the interests of existing residents and the interests of the younger generation who are currently locked out of the system. And what has to happen is that those who currently have to lock out in a sort of revolutionary scenario have to rise up and win. Now, I think there are plenty of moral and philosophical problems with this approach, but set those to one side for the present audience especially. Just consider this. Governments have tried to smash the NIMBYs, not necessarily using that term, for decades, and every time they fail. NIMBYs are very, very effective as a political force, whether or not they actually make up a majority of the community. And we saw this recently in Chesham and Amersham, very powerfully. So if there is a solution to this problem, it lies not in the trial of strength, but rather in, firstly, making development less obnoxious to existing communities, and there are a range of ways that you can do that. And secondly, sharing some of the enormous planning gain that you get from permission, some of the enormous value that is created through development with the communities that are currently opposing it, to make it in their interests to buy their consent, their support, and indeed their championship. And there are examples of this happening abroad and historically, and I think that is the way, this path of reconciliation of what seem to be opposed interests is the way forward, if there is a way forward, for planning reform in this country. And that's what I will urge today. So that's what I want to say to start with.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I'll now go to a sort of shared Q&A where I'll ask some questions. I'll direct them to my panelists, but then if you guys want to come in once the person I've directed to finishes their answer. So I'll start off with Ben. We now have a department for levelling up and housing, D-Luck or so. It's horrible.
I have absolutely no idea how we're going to pronounce that.
Not too hard.
Lol hook.
And I'm sure you've spent a lot of time talking about housing and levelling up at this conference. Are we any closer to knowing what levelling up means and what the future of the planning reforms might be?
Well, I hope we will be by the end of the week. But I think in really simple terms, levelling up means that we need people growing up in towns that have been neglected, disadvantaged, left behind over the course of the last few decades have the same opportunities afforded to them that people growing up in the south of east of England and London. That is as simple as you can possibly make it. Now, I think the challenge for the new department, and what I'm really excited about in actually getting levelling up in the title, is that we can't possibly begin to address and then solve the width and depth of that challenge without working across Whitehall. So yes, housing is at the centre of levelling up, and people are at the centre of levelling up. But you've kind of got this whole series of policy interventions and market forces around the edge of it, beginning with jobs, looking at skills, at education, at infrastructure, possibly some pump priming by the government. I think we all accept that might need to be some kind of capital incentives to get business going. Then the inward investment that you would get from the private sector, and then right back through to kind of the skills that are needed to do those jobs that we have created, creating this virtuous circle where we've got people who are benefiting from all of this attention, and the houses that they live in the right place at the right time to the right quality standards, and of course to the right price point. So what makes me quite excited about this whole thing is that having Michael Gove at the head of that department, is that he doesn't have a reputation for playing it safe. He doesn't have a reputation for being bullied by a Whitehall department. So if he can do what he has done in some other departments, which is essentially dismantle them and then reassemble them in kind of the form that he wants them, then we do stand a good chance of actually being able to address this in a way that isn't the traditional Whitehall kind of siloed mentality of here is a target for 300,000 houses, go away and do it. It is looking at it in the totality about the infrastructure, about the jobs, about the skills, about that economic investment, strategic investment in these places, so that we can actually make it about people. And that brings us back to the fact that levelling up is about people. It's about the opportunities that these people should be having that historically they haven't.
I mean, if anyone has any comments on that, I mean, I know as far as the ASI is concerned, we feel that building more is really central to levelling up. But I would also like to ask, our polling, as some of you may see from our leaflets, we ran a little short, suggests that building more homes could be a huge vote winner. Contrary to sort of conventional wisdom, is that if the Conservatives build more homes, they'll undermine their core constituencies, and their majority will be, decimated at worst. I would like to ask the panel: do you think that in reality it could be a huge electoral boon to get behind building more? Sam, if you could.
I think the short answer is yes. I was struck recently. I don't know if anyone has had the pleasure of scrolling through the Conservative Party poster archive. Has anyone done that recently? It's one nod. Fantastic. Well, I recommend that you do, because not only is it just interesting to see how the party has campaigned over many, many years. One thing struck me when I was scrolling back through all the old Maggie posters and what have you. When you take a time period between, say, the 1920s and the 1980s, the issues that come up all the time in that literature, one of which is housing. But then after the 80s, it kind of disappears from the party's propaganda. It kind of floats away. And I'll just give you some examples, because I was really struck by this, because you go through the history, and the Tory party used to think that housing was a vote winner, and used to campaign very aggressively on that front, both before the introduction of the planning laws as described, but also afterwards as well. I mean, there's one here from 1929. It screams at you, 800,000 houses built by the Conservatives in the last 4 years. 1951, had enough high prices, house hunting, vote Conservative. 1963, building 1,000 houses a day, and obviously in the 80s you get a million council homes sold to tenants. But these days, housing from a purely electoral party political perspective is seen as is a difficult issue to be managed, to be dealt with, and hopefully put away quietly in its box so it doesn't need to trouble us. Chesham and Amersham, which was mentioned as an obvious example of that. That is, I suspect, why Michael Gove was put in the housing brief. We hope it's for his reforming zeal, but I suspect it's because he's very adept at managing difficult issues and making sure that they don't disturb the headlines too much, whilst building a whole swathe across the north and not disturbing the shires nearly as much as perhaps was intimated by the reform. So the point is, we know from this research and countless other research that's been out there over the years that there is a big majority available to any political party that chooses to grab it for home building, because the house crisis has gotten so bad over the last few years. And what I find really interesting, and this is something the party is going to have to deal with over the next few years, is the younger activist base in the Tory party, people who are now getting involved in the party in their early 20s, coming up even to their early 30s, because they themselves can't get on the housing ladder, they take a very different attitude to some of the older generation, and I absolutely take the point that it should not be a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be older versus younger generation, because actually, in the research that we've done, you speak to older voters, they worry about, and they're homeowners, they've made it, but they worry about the prospects for their kids and their grandkids. So they're not blind to this issue, right? They're not completely selfish in the way that they can be characterized when you take a very adversarial approach to this. But there is a change of attitude coming through, not just nationally, but within the party itself. And those 20-year-olds, those 30-year-olds, they're going to start running for council and getting into positions of decision-making and influence, will see that their peers support house building in a way that the current generation perhaps don't quite hear that message yet, and they will start to change. And so we all see housing as a political threat, but it is actually a political opportunity, and if we don't grab it, then somebody else will. I know the Lib Dems might prosper in certain areas, of course, with an ultra NIMBYist message, but you know, I'm amazed the Labour Party really hasn't gripped this yet in certain areas, beyond the obvious kind of social housing angle that you have seen. But somebody will grab it, and if it's not us, who's going to grab it? And that is the question kind of hanging over from a political perspective. And of course, as we know, you can't divorce the politics from the policy on this. Yeah. The politics drive it, because we gave decision making to the politicians in the 1940s. We said to local councillors, you decide. By the way, you're up for election every 4 years and you'll be held accountable for that. So that's, I think we've really got to get our heads around.
Yeah, I do think I think it's a vote winner, right? I think the extent to which NIMBYism is actually a determinant of elections is probably overstated. And the reason I think that has happened is because, as we know, the people that get very incensed about new developments near them, they're overwhelmingly people who are retired, who have a lot of time on their hands and are often, you know, they're fairly eloquent, they're educated people who are able to go and pressure politicians and to really make their presence known. And I think they occupy perhaps a larger space in the mind of politicians than they actually occupy in reality, in the real world. I think they seem a bigger force than they are, and they probably don't determine elections to the extent that we think they do. I mean, people have already mentioned, obviously, Chesham and Amersham. I think there are a lot of issues going on there, and it's not necessarily just NIMBYism. I mean, HS2 is set aside. I don't think many people in Chesham and Amersham even knew about planning reforms potentially happening. So it's probably a bit of a stretch to say that determined that. And what we do know that wins votes is people like rising living standards. People like, you know, their costs to go down, they like their disposable income to rise, and that is exactly what you can do very, very easily by reducing the cost of housing, because it is taking up an enormous portion of young people's income, or first-time buyers' income. And, you know, people don't necessarily think in their minds, oh, this is because of the planning reforms that were passed in 2022 or whatever. But what they do realise is their life has improved, and they like that, and they are therefore more likely to keep an incumbent government in place. So it might not in the public discourse, it might not look as if it's popular, but I think it certainly is when people realise that their lives are improved through that.
So, yeah, I'm not an expert on forecasting elections, so I don't speak under correction here. I think it's probably so. In terms of partisan advantage for the Conservative Party, I suspect that it is widely claimed, and is probably quite good evidence for this, that homeowners are more likely to vote Conservative, and that one of the reasons for the Labour surge among the young in the 2010s probably was falling home ownership and the sense of not having a stake in society. And it's probably, therefore, true that it is in the interests, and indeed in the vital interests, of the Conservative Party in the long run to address the housing shortage. I think that's probably, I'm not, as I say, I'm not certain of this, but I think it's probably profound truth. I'm less optimistic, I fear, than the rest of the panel that short-term political advantage necessarily lies in building houses. I think it depends on the way the houses are built and the kind of opposition it comes up against. But I mean, one issue is, so suppose that the government's reform proposals had gone through in their original version and we had built 300,000 houses a year for the next term in Parliament, or right up to the election after that. That would not have had a huge effect on house prices. I mean, Anya's quoted the figure of a shortage of 3 million. Depends how you quantify shortage, but the shortage might be much larger than that, and that's dynamic. It's not the case that once we've built a certain number of 2 million houses, half the shortage will be over, because population continues to rise and households continue to become smaller and agglomeration effects continue to grow in the south. So even on the quite bullish figures that people were talking about on the number of houses that could get built, you don't necessarily see prices for the crisis ending, or the kind of appreciable end to the housing crisis that would win support for the government. Whereas I do think it probably does produce quite intense local resistance in some places. So, I mean, my view is that in the short term, under the current planning regime, forcing through much higher housing targets probably is risky for the Conservative Party. And that's probably exactly what... I mean, the government is not stupid on this kind of question. They probably are aware of these risks, and that's why it's moving in this area. I don't think it has to be that way. I think there are other models, other ways of building homes that would not produce that kind of resistance and would produce probably more homes as well. But I think under the current system, the risks, I suspect, are fairly real. And I fear I'm pessimistic to some extent on that question.
Can I just jump in there? Because rather than being pessimistic, I'm rather more optimistic. I mentioned in the introductory remarks that the market doesn't function like a market, and that predominantly is because we know we have huge demand for houses, and yet supply is not keeping up. So unpicking the blockers to that are critical. But really, one of the things that gives me reason to be optimism is when you talk to the industry players, the developers, the land promoters, they all want to build some houses. They're not in it not to build houses. So there is this willingness in the market there to provide a product that consumers want. And so the odds are really in our favour. Now I recognise that we're not in the best of financial circumstances, but look at any government throughout history and you probably get that response from the Treasury anyway. No Treasury is going to say, yeah, we're awash with money, actually just knock yourself out. Well, unless it was Labour. What we need to do is put targeted interventions together, reform the planning system, make it easier to build the right houses in the right place at the right time, actively connect it to the Levelling Up Fund, and take out some of the politics and the political landmines that were mentioned in the introduction. I mean, I don't want to go too off message here, but releasing the white paper at the same time as the algorithm housing needs analysis was just politically stupid. Because it meant there was no genuine coalition for getting more houses built. So we do need to put more houses in the levelling up areas. We do need to reconsider those areas where demand is high, yet the need in terms of the social levelling up need is lower. Essentially, the government needs to get its finger out, make some decisions, make it easier to build houses and easier to go through planning. So optimism rather than pessimism, I say.
Okay, so speaking of optimism and pessimism, I know some have voiced concerns that the government's proposals, frozen though they are a developer's charter, that they sort of trade democratic local input for frictionless development, in which only sort of expensive, higher margin, profit-seeking housing is built. And I wanted to ask the panel, do you think these fears can be addressed at the same time as actually achieving meaningful planning reform? I mean, Sam, if you want to take that to start with.
I mean, so specifically on this question of developers' charters and, well, I mean, so the idea, I mean, bashing developers is obviously one of these childish things that you, like, all the good cities of the world were built by private developers, right? They're perfectly whether they build good stuff or bad stuff is just a question of what kind of incentives the regulatory system produces for them. They're legally obliged. So I also don't really think it's true that developers are making gigantic profits. They're not the people. There is one group that's making gigantic profits from the current system, which is landowners. It's interesting that developers' charter is always it's a kind of, I think maybe it's just economic illiteracy or something like that that's going on behind this, that people haven't thought this through. But some developers make quite a lot of money, but they're not making like huge super economic profits in the way that you occasionally see in bits of the tech industry and so on. The people who do make huge profits from the current system are landowners who get allocations because land is so scarce, allocated land is so scarce. So when the allocation is finally given, there are these famous cases in which if you allocate a bit of land in certain parts of the southeast, its value increases by like many tens of thousands of %. And that obviously, now, the government doesn't want this. They do their best to address it in some ways, but it's very difficult to do so under the current system. And obviously that does produce resentment, and that probably is one of the things that will make planning reform harder. The proposals, one thing that will make this a bit easier is if you can, return to my core theme. One of the ways in which you can make planning reform more popular is by finding ways of not concentrating development gain in small minorities of landowners and making sure it enriches a much wider variety of people. That's good for buying those people into the system, but it's also good more generally for the reputation of building, because people will be able to see that a much wider range of people are benefiting from this, and it isn't so clearly benefiting a small minority. So the planning white paper had many good ideas in it. I don't think it was a developer's charter. I think it was, they were well-intentioned, sensible ideas in many ways. But there is an issue with the current system, which is that it does massively concentrate benefit, and that does make people think less well of development, and that is one of the issues that we face, and another reason that we need to look at the structure of the system as it is at the moment.
Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to actually echo that, actually. The thing about developers making big profits is really, really interesting, because one of the things that we do know about the way the planning system functions is that small developers are routinely wiped out by planning refusals. If you get a large scheme through planning permission, then you will make a reasonable profit on it, but that profit you have to adjust it for risk. There's a good chance, one in 10 planning permissions are rejected, right? And that is even after developers don't go for planning permission until they're pretty confident that they've met all of the planning policies. So it suggests that there is a pretty high risk if you get it wrong. And there are small developers going under all of the time. We have a very, very low proportion of our housing is delivered by smaller developers because they've been wiped out by this excessively risky system. And so that's something that I don't think people really understand. And as Samuel said, that it's kind of just economic illiteracy on the part of people saying that. And what I try to, and if anyone has a good suggestion for how to counter that point, because I feel like I spend my life battling with people on Twitter about whether it's a bad thing for developers to make profits. I don't care whether developers make profits. I just want more homes.
Yeah. I concur entirely, because absolutely we want more houses and we want capitalism to work. So what's not to like? That's great. And in many ways, as ever, it's kind of the state getting in the way of the system working. So the more things that we can do to get the state out of the way and get the market to do its job, then the better. And just to come in on the SME house builders point, obviously, we post credit crunch, we lost so many SME house builders, over the last sort of decade or so, simply because of access to finance, because frankly it wasn't, because small house building firms were struggling. It wasn't an attractive business to pass on to your children or to go in and do as a new venture. When you talk to the larger house builders, they really do want that SME sector there. They want the smaller house builders in, because frankly they don't want to be piddling about with smaller developments. They want to max out on some big sort of 1,000 home developments. Why would they mess around with 6 in a village somewhere? So it should work. And now that we have more control of our economy, having taken back control, we need to look at ways of encouraging access to finance, encouraging more players in the market, so that we can actually get the system working again.
I'm going to say something that shouldn't be controversial at a Tory party conference, but I think profit's good.
Yay! Capitalism, baby.
Oh, thank God there was applause. I was just going to... God, I was about to really worry then. You see this in any market, in any sector. The more you regulate it, the better it is for the bigger players. And so we have, every time we tweak the system, every time we load some more bureaucracy onto it, if you're on the private sector side of things, size matters. You need to be big in order to absorb the risks that are created by the system, and the smaller players that could come in could be more competitive, could produce a better product for a lower price, because we like that, right? We like competition. It kills them. It drives them out of the market. I'll just go back very briefly to something that Sam said about the short-term political risk of being pro-development to the Conservative Party, and I think that's right. And by the way, are there any developers here? So brave. 2 of them put up their hands. Welcome to the pit of NIMBYism. No, I'm joking. So, for the government, first of all, you can go 2 ways with planning reform. You can either say, let's try and get rid of the NIMBYs. Let's try and take away their voice because they're bloody irritating, and we'd quite like to build more, which is sort of what the white paper was aiming at. I'm simplifying it a lot, but that's where it was aiming at. Or you say, let's really dial up the goodies. Let's say, well, you have to provide this, that, and the other, and all the lovely baubles that come with development in order to incentivize people to come along and support things. We're not going to get, I suspect, the let's get rid of the NIMBYs kind of planning reform that was talked about, and there's probably some very good reasons for that. So instead, we're going to get something like let's dial up the incentives. And the one thing that the development sector could do to help the government politically get this through is to dial up the support themselves, because we know it's out there. It always strikes me the development sector is expert at talking to people that don't like it. It spends a lot of its time doing the necessary consultation and talking to everyone. That's what you're supposed to do, and that's a good thing. But by the nature of it, the sector ends up talking to existing homeowners that don't want to see things happen for understandable reasons. And they only ever talk to them. And it always strikes me, I always think, well, why don't you go and talk to the people that want to see houses built and get their voice into the process? Give the politicians a little bit of help, a little bit of cover, so that it is marginally less controversial in the short term to make the necessary changes to get us closer to the sorts of numbers that the economists will tell us and the social scientists will tell us that we need in order to fix the problem and address the price issue, which is complicated. It isn't just about supply, as we know, but I tell you what, supply helps getting those numbers up. So let's not make it antagonistic. Let's help the planning reforms by just engaging with, and government can do this as well, by the way. It's not just down to developers. The local government can do this. Go and talk to the people who would benefit from having a home, not just from the capturing the benefits of development. And I will just finish on this. I hear a lot of people say, well, you need to talk about the mitigations. It's almost as if we're embarrassed to just talk about the building more homes point. We have to come up with all these other reasons to support home building, and all, there'll be X affordable, and there'll be a new playground, and we'll fund the bus route, and that's good. We should have more of that. But actually, the people that will support development, their primary reason for being supporters is that you are going to add to the housing stock, and the other things are helpful and they're nice cherries on top, but they want the supply. So let's get them involved.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a slightly unorthodox question here, which is, in this debate about housing, we have the sort of supply side team, which is us, effectively, and we're always saying, just build more homes. People are priced out of the housing market, but there seems to be quite an entrenched perspective that actually you can't solve the housing crisis by just building more. That sort of price and supply are not correlated in this case. And I was wondering if someone could provide quite a simple explanation of that dichotomy and why, in your perspective, I'm assuming on this panel that would be wrong. Ben, you sound like you have some thoughts.
Can you supply a simple answer? And the answer is no, because if it was simple, we would have done it. It's a hugely complicated issue. We've had decades of successive state intervention in the housing market, and every time that we've tried to fix it, we've broken it some more. We've had interventions that on paper have achieved their policy objective, but ultimately with the constraints on supply have actively managed to push affordability away. So no, there is no simple answer, is the short answer there.
Right on. Okay, so fair enough.
Sorry about that one.
That's all right. So we've done some polling, which you can see on the sheets. But something that's not mentioned there, actually, is that we found that 52% of people have an incorrect understanding of what the green belt actually refers to, and that 14% of people actually don't even know what it is at all. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask the panel, do we think having the fight about the green belt, I know we get accused of suggesting we should concrete over the green belt fairly often, and that's not a narrative that I want to push particularly. But do we think it's worth having that fight with a sort of entrenched NIMBY perspective on the green belt, or perhaps should we focus our efforts elsewhere? Is it simply not worth it? Anya, if you want to start that one off.
Yeah, so funny enough, the green belt was one of the issues that got me involved in this issue in the first place. You probably won't be surprised to know that I think we should abolish the green belt. It's a totally superfluous policy, even in terms of preserving green spaces, right? The green belt is not an environmental designation. It's purely a restriction designed to prevent cities from growing outwards. And actually all of the land that is within the green belt that is green and is beautiful and we should protect can be protected under existing planning designations and does not need to be protected under green belt ones. And of course, I'm sure many of you will know, the green belt also includes a lot of previously developed land. It includes things like petrol stations, car parks, that kind of nonsense. Do I think, however, it's worth my time campaigning actively to abolish the green belt? No, because I'm not going to win that one. If I thought I was going to win it, I wouldn't have stopped talking about it today. But do I think we could probably go for kind of more incremental reforms, things like release brownfield land in the green belt? Yeah. I think that is potentially far more winnable, because then even in the terms of the policy that you're pushing for, it's clear that you aren't talking about concreting over beautiful forests or something like that. So I think it is potentially winnable, but even then difficult. There are people that really don't want you to know that there are car parks in the green belt, because those car parks are near their houses and they like parking their cars in them. So it's still a difficult battle, and it's not one of the things I work on most proactively for that reason. Nonetheless, I do like to say it all of the time, because I hope that over the next 20 years, if I continue to do this every year, eventually something will happen.
There's an old phrase in campaigning, which is when you're explaining, you're losing. And unfortunately, when it comes to the green belt, as Anya has just said, you're never going to win that one. Any one of us in this room who has ever been involved at any level in electoral politics knows that, which is a shame, because Anya's right. In reality, there are many examples where it is not green and pleasant land. I've been involved in schemes where literally it was an airport, It was a runway. But yes, it was technically greenbelt, so you couldn't do anything on it. There has to be an element of pragmatism there, but that is, if you try and go down that road, all you're going to do is lock in the people that really don't like you, and the people who might support you will be scared off, because you say it's just those two words, powerful. Those two words, you put them together. You can shut down debate instantly, and that is a product of many years, and we're probably not going to get over that.
So I just agree with everything that just said. Like, it's a trap. Like, it's an elementary bear trap for the pro-reform people attacking the green belt. Every so often someone lumbers into it and immediately gets speared, and they're like, don't do it, don't go there. It's totally futile. But it's a good occasion to remind ourselves of, like, how crazy it is, the places where stuff is getting built in this country at the moment. There's also one reason to be cautious about, like, raw figures on the total number of things being built. Like, we don't actually have, it's not exactly true that we have a national housing shortage. There are many areas of Britain where the sales price of houses is way below build cost. Right? These areas they need jobs, but they don't need more houses being built there. And if we build houses there, which in some amazing cases we do, we're not actually addressing the housing shortage, even though we may increase our national figures on how many houses we're delivering. So it's very well worth looking at the data on where floor space values are highest and where the largest number of homes are being added relative to the existing housing stock. Because there is very little correlation between those two things in this country. And we are adding, like, car-dependent greenfield estates in the middle of Northumberland and Leicestershire. And this is a very, very strange thing to be happening. And it's very important to, like, retain a sense of, like, how deeply odd it is. Not just the number of homes we build, but the places in which we build them. So while strongly agreeing with my colleagues that, don't go there, don't touch the green belt, it's also a time for us to return to a core article of our faith and remember, just how mad the locational stuff is at the moment.
So I have a couple of questions left before we move to audience Q&A. I won't take too long, I promise. So something that I think we're often in agreement with, somewhat bizarrely on panels like these, is the left. They identify the need for more housing because part of their core demographic is young people. Young people can't afford housing. But their perspective on things is often that we need more social housing. And I wanted to ask maybe, Ben, if sort of what your perspective is on the role social housing would play. I mean, I know you've talked about developers quite often so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think social housing is an important part of the mix. We have to recognise that we need places for people to live. And we've got an excellent education system in the UK, obviously, and in particular in my patch in Milton Keynes and Buckinghamshire. And we've got a situation where when children get a good education, they get good A-levels, they go away to university, and then they don't come back because they can't afford to come back. So nobody's going to go to university and then go and buy a house in the area that they grew up in. They just simply can't afford to. We need to recognise that. So having a sort of a private rented sector, having a social housing sector is a very important part of that life cycle of into home ownership. It's not, you don't just kind of magically grow a homeowner. So very important. And ultimately, the more supply we have of any type is going to be chipping away at that affordability conundrum. So let's get more players in the market. Let's get more tenures. It doesn't matter who owns them, who lives in them. Just let's get them.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because I think most Tories get nervous around the word social housing. And what I mean by that is, again, I come a lot at this from a purely campaigning perspective, so forgive me for that. But we know that when we say when we put the two words affordable and housing together, nobody believes us. And he knows.
Yeah.
He's actually stood for election. And again, we can explain what the actual official definition of affordable housing is, and then of course you've lost them. But of course, a Labour candidate is more likely to be able to put those two words together, and in the target voter's mind, they are talking about something very different from what we're perceived to be talking about. I think I think as a party we should engage with the different models of social housing a lot more than we do, because you said the phrase, Ben, life cycle, and I think this is a really important point. And this is where housing fits into a broader agenda about what is the Conservative Party for. We don't these days talk as much as we used to about prosperity in the broadest sense. This idea that if you work hard in school, if you get your grades, if you go to a good university, if you work hard there and you graduate and you get a job and then you get a slightly better job and you climb up the ladder of life and eventually you become a homeowner, etc., etc. The housing is what breaks that link. The housing crisis means that you can work really hard, you can be really smart, and you still won't be able to afford a place where you want to live. And if we step back a little bit for a moment and try to look at housing in the context of that life cycle, if the Tory party isn't about that life cycle, I do sort of struggle to think what it is for, and I try not to mean that too negatively, because I prefer to think about these things in terms of opportunities for us to grab. And when it comes to social housing, I started in social housing. I was very, very lucky. I managed to qualify for a scheme that the Housing Association was running, and my first rent was, I think it was 80 quid a week. It was nothing, but it was my first place away from home, and that enabled me to take the next step. That enabled me to get the decent job, to then go into private rented and then eventually home ownership. And if I hadn't had that step, I can tell you now I would not be a homeowner today. So I do think it's important that we recognise the role of social housing in that life cycle. I don't see why local councils and in fact I don't see why the government can't just build not-for-profit housing. Right, and we know how much it costs to build a block of flats. That's fairly well known. The government doesn't need to make a profit. I said profit was good, by the way, and I stand by that. But the government doesn't need to make a profit. It just needs to cover its costs. The government could build a block of flats tomorrow. I'm sort of making this up as I go along. I know that Sam will probably give me a lot of very good reasons why the economics of that don't work out. But hear me out. You could build a block of flats, you could make it all social housing, and the government just needs to cover its costs. And you almost call it starter housing. And you have it limited. You say, well, you've got 5 years, or whatever it is, but this is for you, young person, to get a start in life and to move up that ladder of life. I think we should start to engage with some of those thoughts.
I agree with what's been said. I'm in favour of building houses regardless of tenure type, homes regardless of tenure type. I think it's important to remember, the constraint on the number of homes being built is primarily a matter of the number of permissions that are provided, not a matter of there not being enough resources in the system or build costs being prohibitively high. So, and that's if the state chose to build millions of houses, that would obviously contribute to alleviating the housing shortage. But it's not the lack of huge quantities of state money being put into house building which has caused the housing shortage in the first place. It's the fact that the state is not giving enough permissions to other providers to build the houses, as they did in the 1930s, for instance. But that being said, if it is the case that it is politically easier to build social housing than it is to build private housing, and that's the only way in which we can build houses, then it becomes a kind of priority. Not necessarily my view, but...
Yeah, as the others have said, all housing is good housing, whether it's market housing, whether it's social housing, whether it's affordable home ownership products. They all meet off those goals, they all meet need. And having a mixture of tenures in developments does also help with things like ensuring they're developed faster. Because obviously if you have a kind of absorption rate, only really matters at the very large scale, but at the large scale it matters. And I do think it's easier, certainly from PricedOut's perspective, to make that case to people if you're saying, it isn't just about letting the market rip, also you're meeting other needs as well. And that message actually lands pretty well generally, so I don't see it as being in conflict.
Right, do we have any questions from the audience? Perfect. Great. Right, I've got a magician's assistant at the back who might be able to help me with the microphone. There we are. If we could go to the lady in the second row on my left, your right.
Thank you very much. I've got so much to say, you'll have to grab this back off of me. You all talk as though NIMBYism, it has no solution, and yet there are other countries, and particularly the Netherlands, where it's virtually disappeared. And that's because a compensation, when there are big things being built, big projects, is deemed as fair. And we don't ever seem to look at what other countries do to see if we can learn anything from them. Going back to your point about silos, Ben, I've presented to HS2 with an idea which, for ease, is think flood re, but it would actually be compensation. And I said to HS2, would this make HS2 easier if it had been in place? And they said, yes, we urge you to talk to the Treasury. You go to the Treasury. Oh, talk to the Department for Transport. Silo, silo, silo. So even when there's solutions to things, getting government's attention. Okay, it was Brexit, then it was COVID, but it's so frustrating because I do believe there is something we can do to unlock this. Most NIMBYs are worried about their house price, and HS2 need to sell. Buying all these houses is absolutely mad. There's cleverer ways of going about this. I've said my bit.
Oh, Ben, I think that's probably one for you to kick off.
I think the question about learning from other countries is an excellent point, and there are plenty of things that we can learn. I'd love to understand the kind of the culture of self-build in Germany, for example. Certainly, broadly the planning system in the Netherlands is very similar to ours, but it's implied in a much more sensitive and flexible way, which makes the developments that they actually end up with much more acceptable to the communities. And they do simple things like when they put the cycle lanes in, that's where all the utilities go. So you never have the roads closed because they dig up the cycle lanes rather than the roads. So the traffic functions. It's simple stuff like that. Look at Scandinavia and how they've embraced the kind of the modular building, and they've scaled that up, which is a challenge that we need to address in the UK. We have modular builders in our market, but they're not scaled up to the extent that they're going to solve the problem. And frankly, the build costs on modern methods of construction buildings in the south are still higher than traditional build. So why would we do it? So plenty that we can learn from, and the opportunity, having paused the planning reforms, planning white paper, is to really pour some of that stuff into whatever solution we come up with. I have no idea what the solution's going to look like. And with regard to your yes minister question, I don't have as much optimism as I normally have with sort of getting a cross-Whitehall approach to some of the more tricky issues, unless it's behind that kind of totemic levelling up agenda, and I'm particularly pessimistic because you've mentioned the words HS2.
If anyone else wants to come in?
So on the point about looking at other countries, yes, I sometimes feel like I'm talking to a brick wall in the housing sector when I'm kind of saying, people are saying to me, we couldn't possibly build 300,000 homes a year. Look at France. Look, they have the same population as us. They're building far more homes. They're doing something that we could be copying. And on the point about compensation as well, I totally agree, but I think Samuel's probably better placed to answer that one than me because he's got a very good policy.
Well, yes. So, I totally agree about international comparisons. And it's amazing how far policy debate, I think not just in this country, I think generally happens without any knowledge of the planning, even the basics of how foreign planning systems work. Partly because maybe quite a sort of boring technical subject. Fascinating, exciting, and fun from my point of view, but from most people's point of view, boring technical subject, and people don't write much about it in except in texts intended for people who are professionally involved. I don't know. The one caution, very briefly on that, though, is there is, you do get equilibria in a country which can be quite hard to shift. So, like, in Germany, I think it's something close to permitted development to build on your back garden in suburban areas. You can build a second house, provided it isn't flush with the plot boundaries and doesn't overlook in certain ways. And it's very, very widely used. So German suburbs have this most curious appearance, if you look on from Google Street View, that they often have like 4 lines of houses in each block, the original 2 and then the extra 2 that have been added in the back gardens. This doesn't, as far as I know, this is not a controversial area of house building in Germany, and it adds a lot to urban density. But it probably doesn't necessarily mean we could just introduce PD for garden grabbing in this country without serious political resistance, right? That was, in fact, there was attempts to move in that direction in the 2000s, and there was massive resistance. Because you get into an equilibrium and people's expectations develop around that and so. So I do very strongly agree with the point about international comparisons, but that's just a caution that also has to be added to that. The thing on compensation, yes, that is, as I have said already, I think the core of the solution here is buying in communities. The thing I'm known for in this, or the thing I work on, the version of this I work on, is allowing individual suburban streets to vote by supermajority to go up to sort of traditional European densities. So what in this country we associate with like Georgian terraces or Victorian mansion blocks, 5 stories, high plot use, 4 stories. Huge financial incentives for people on the streets to vote in favour, because in much of the country you could literally become asset millionaires at a stroke by doing this. And by doing that, there's enormous quantities of very, very sparse, already urbanized areas. You could meet all of the housing shortage that Anya refers to through this kind of intensification that you can unlock through this. And I think, on very plausible modeling, you can do that with not just the consent, but with the championship of existing communities. Now, that's just one example of the kind of policy that we should be thinking about, and the models that are used in the Netherlands are also very interesting ones to work on. But I think, yes, the basic approach when one is going about trying to solve the housing question should be, okay, who are the people stopping this? And how can we share some of the enormous value uplift that is available here? There is so much value. We are sitting on value. Yeah. There is so much here that we can buy in nearly everybody. Yes, so the case of the Netherlands and quite a few other cases internationally illustrate this point very well.
Just quickly on the point of compensation, we kind of already do compensation, we just don't do it directly. Yeah. So we have what's known as Section 106 contributions, which many of you will be aware of, but there's a middleman, and the middleman is the local authority. And I don't think it would be a massive stretch to repurpose that, to have some more direct community involvement, embracing some of the models that Sam talks about, because, look, you've got to try and bind local communities in. Okay, I come from the side of the argument that says get the supporters out there, but I'm not blind to existing homeowners. I'm an existing homeowner myself. I can freely admit I have objected to planning applications. And we've got to bind people together as much as possible if we are going to crack this social and political problem as much as it is an economic problem.
All right, if we go to the gentleman in the snazzy jacket with the sunglasses. Mustard coloured. On my right, your left. There we are.
Thank you. Out of curiosity, it's one thing to build homes, but we're often seeing that a lot of new homes that are being built are poor quality, and often new build is rapidly becoming a byword for bad build. And so I wonder if the panel have any thoughts on how we can ensure that new houses being built are houses worth living in, and you're not buying an expensive waste that you'll have to spend more money on fixing.
Yeah, it's an incredibly good point. And part of the reason for this is that planning authorities are significantly underfunded. They're understaffed. It is a tough job, and frankly, I know as a councillor that the planning team are essentially they've got a target on their back from all sides, and I played my part in that as well. So it's an incredibly tough job, and there are not enough people doing it. So occasionally these things do slip through the net. The way we resolve that is not a quick fix. We need more planners and better quality planners in local authorities, and frankly we don't pay them enough. So as soon as you get a good planner in local authorities, they bugger off to the private sector and earn 2-3 times as much and never come back. So we're going to have to make planning sexy, which is a really tough ask, but that involves possibly apprenticeship schemes. It involves getting more planning courses into local colleges, potentially even universities as well, and making it a career that is actually well rewarded and well valued by society.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. I agree that. So part of the issue is that local authorities don't always have the tools that they need to demand better from developers, and in some cases they, if they had these tools, if there is plenty of land value sitting there, in theory, I mean, if you put in the local plan in a really high land value area that all doors must be made of gold, right? All doors will be made of gold, right? You would depress the sale value of the land a bit, but substantially, but you could still sell the houses at the end of it. The other issue here, I think, is probably that so much of the desirable land for house building is barred to house building. So where do we end up house building? Like, we don't do intensification, or very, very little of it. We don't build in like the hugely desirable greenbelt areas, or in any of the really desirable areas of the countryside that are national parks and AOMBs and so on and so forth. Don't build in any conservation areas, or very, very marginally. So like, all the areas, a lot of the high-value housing areas are actually closed off to the market, and we do end up building in areas where viability is marginal. Yes. Yeah. And if that's the case, then we're probably not going to build really, really high-end stuff. So I think there's also one part of the question that we were alluding to earlier about where land is being released for building. That is one of the other factors, and I think the third is probably. If we're releasing land in like quite remote places, so it's not intensification, sometimes it's brownfield, which is fine, but if it's not intensification and it's often not greenfield, it's not in the greenbelt, not adjacent to the metropolis, where instead it's like greenfield sites in areas of the country that are too politically weak to resist development happening in them, then you end up with car dependence because people really are reliant on cars. It's not even the fault of the developer. Like you really need to have quite a few cars to live in these locations with any level of convenience, and that creates all sorts of problems with urban form and with single use and with the lack of walkability and so on. So I think a lot of these things are, again, downstream from the more fundamental issues that we have with the allocation of land in this country.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, if we go to the gentleman on the left with the coat.
Thank you. I walked in as you talked about 20 to 30-year-olds getting involved in politics. I'm a 28-year-old councillor in West Sussex. If I campaigned for housing, I'd be out. Okay? That's the reality. If you come and knock on doors in Horsham in West Sussex where we can't agree on our local plan, it's been delayed multiple times. Yeah. We will be run by the Liberal Democrats or a resident association, as has happened in Oxfordshire County Council, as has happened in Guildford. So I'll just say the problem with the planning system is it's so political, and the people who vote for me are all 65 and over because the turnout is 30-40%. Young people don't vote in elections, and that's the problem that you have. The planning white paper, which you've talked about, would have got rid of that NIMBYism, but now that's not going to happen. And until this whole sale reform in the planning system, it's going to continue being political, and you won't build the houses, and you continue to build the houses in the wrong places. But please come and campaign for me anyway.
Well, I mean, fascinating you say that. We Just Build Homes recently ran a campaign in Horsham. And we've got about 100 supporters so far.
Well, I'll talk to you. What site?
I'll talk to you afterwards. Yeah. It's just a wonderful coincidence because what you've said there is absolutely the problem when it comes to the politics and not being able to divorce the politics from the economics. whilst we are in a situation where councillors such as yourself feel the political pressure to go with the objectors, and actually, no, it's overwhelming political pressure. As you say, it's not a 50-50, 52-48, whatever it was, pressure. It's overwhelming pressure. So politically, the government has to find a way to mobilise the other side of the argument so that councillors can do what they want to do, which is consider the merits of each application and look at the policy and think of everyone's interest and try and come to the right decision, because that's what you're in the game for, rather than having to just shut off immediately because you know the politics are just going to drive you out of office. That's, I think, what this comes down to. But yeah, I'll talk to you afterwards.
I think part of it is, and I totally recognise the situation you've described. I think you very, very adequately and appropriately just condensed the political issue at the local level. I think part of the solution is going to be to remove the situation where communities tend to find out about a large planning proposal near them at the last minute. You know, when it's kind of gone through its first stage, and when there's pictures, you know, when there's a map. Of how close this new development will be to your village or whatever it is. So getting communities involved at an earlier stage will give you a chance to have that conversation with them, get them to be part of the solution. And then as a politician, that gives you kind of a bit more wiggle room to say, well, it's kind of, we need this so that your grandchildren can buy a house near you and they can look after you in your old age, and you can see your grandkids and that kind of thing. And you know, this is going to happen, so how are we going to make this the right thing to do? Because ultimately, if you're having that conversation in a collaborative, participatory way, it is much easier to do. So more involvement and fewer surprises for communities will really take that political sting out of it.
Okay. Ooh, we might not have time for all the questions, but I'll try and get through them if we can try and expedite our answers perhaps a little bit. Let's go for man in the jumper and shirt directly across from you.
Hi everyone. I was just wondering what you guys thought were the lowest hanging fruits in housing policy. What are the easy, quick wins you could convince a minister to support, even if they are not particularly YIMBY, they may even be a bit NIMBY? Yeah. What ideas do you have?
Really, I mean, the quick answer is they're all gone. And if anything looks like a quick win, it probably isn't. We'll probably mess something up further down the chain.
Any more optimistic answers? Yeah. You've got one. Fantastic.
Yeah. The quick win policy I have is you allow roof extensions on 18th and 19th century buildings. I wrote a paper on this recently, right? So this was totally standard for hundreds of years. People would add roof extensions, mansard roofs, and according to various strict design codes that existed at the time. That's normally banned now for no very good reason. And there are probably several 100,000 houses in high demand areas that could take a roof extension that would look totally in keeping with this existing character, provided it was strictly design coded, but which aren't allowed, or only with extreme difficulty can they get permission for this under the existing system. So if you created a track for getting this, adding mansards to appropriate houses subject to a strict design code, you'd get, I don't know, floor space equivalent of 100,000 apartments or 200,000 apartments, and I see very, very few downsides to it. So it's not a very big fruit, not going to solve the housing shortage, but it is a fruit, and I think it's low-hanging.
Okay. If we come to the man in the mint green shirt at the front.
Hey, thank you. So as much as smashing the NIMBYs would fill my heart with joy, fully accept it's not going to happen. We've seen that time and time again, right? So then it comes to how are we going to get past them? So there are two ways that I see we could do it. The first of which is essentially front-loading developments with things like schools and hospitals and saying, okay, if you invest in this, you're going to get something out of it. But that probably preferences large developers because it involves a huge amount of organisation, it involves a huge amount of money as well. So I have reservations on that. The second one has real problems with a sort of equity in society. So it would be potentially moving, and the political challenge of actually putting the reform forward, which would be allowing planning uplift to go to the community as well. So the other side to that is you're potentially paying dividends to the chief beneficiaries, of their own economic rent seeking, which is a real problem. But is there any other way, or what are the challenges involved in those areas, basically?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so on the first one, we kind of already have a system in place to do that, the S106 system and also the community infrastructure levy. And it's really, really interesting because it's one of the things that, you know, NIMBYs have essentially said, oh, I would support this development if it did this. And it's absolutely fascinating when it actually comes down to it. It doesn't seem to stop them. I was on a panel last week and people gave the example of a hospital that wanted to build a children's cancer ward, and the local NIMBYs opposed that because of the effect on parking. And funnily enough, when the person said that, someone else on the panel said, oh, was that the one in my constituency near me? It wasn't. This has happened more than once. And another example recently that I saw of, I can't remember what local authority it was in now, but there was a school that was going to be developed as part of the development, and the local NIMBY campaign were opposing it anyway because of, you know, whatever reasons they invent on each occasion. And I spoke to someone who was devastated because they lived in the area and all of the other schools were full. But obviously people who campaign against housing and new building tend to not need schools because they're not children. So it's kind of I do think the second point is probably the crucial one there, is that people may say that they would be more supportive of, and maybe some people are, right, but the point is there's always enough people who are not satisfied with however nice the development is, and maybe this kind of compensation system that directly goes to them is what breaks that, as much as I don't like it either, because I would also like to crush the NIMBYs.
I think it's interesting to consider this idea of infrastructure first, which the government have talked about. I think the frustration that I know a lot of developers have is that they will tick every single box. They'll do the Section 106 contributions, the SIL, they'll do whatever the local authority wants, and then they'll still get turned down.
Yeah.
And if we can find a way, I'm not suggesting that they, you know, if you pay X, you're guaranteed permission or anything like that. But I do think if you can find a way to bring that investment forward and provide some kind of certainty for the people taking that investment risk, I think that is a sensible way of looking at how you change the system.
I think that's a very good suggestion, because ultimately it's the lack of corporate skills in negotiating these deals within the public sector, and specifically in local government, that means that the powers that they've got to use things like the SIL and the 106 and also things like schemes like tax incremental financing. There are a plethora of levers that we can pull, but ultimately if the local authority can't go toe-to-toe with a series of corporate lawyers from a developer and come out with something that is going to benefit the community and get delivered, then it's not going to work. So again, it's down to actually respecting the fact that we need more capacity and a bit more love for our planners, so that they can actually deliver their job. I think they do have the powers that they need.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got time for one more question. I'm going to go for the man second row at the back, big beard.
Hello. There's been quite a lot of talk from the panel this afternoon about the need to rebrand, making planning sexy sounds particularly aspirational. But around changing the language of our greenbelt specifically, I'm sure everyone here would love to believe that a few private individuals with the right will and determination could do that themselves. But to what extent do you feel that such campaign needs to be led from government by government?
Ben, that sounds like you're to start with.
I think there's no getting away with it. There's probably always going to be a role for the states in some way to resolving the conundrum of the housing crisis, but partly that's because it's a crisis of the states making in many ways. I mean, there are many other factors to do with it in terms of the disparity in land value and things like labour and material shortages and the variations in supply and demand. But yes, the state will have a role to play in doing that. And when it comes to the wider levelling up agenda, I think that we do need to be less ideological about it and recognise that there has to be some kind of pump priming through business intervention, through infrastructure investment, and through housing investment that will come from central government. The trick will be to do it in these economic circumstances that we're in a way that is capital orientated and not a revenue burden on the state. We want to get in, put some money in, create the right circumstances for the market to operate like a market, to attract private investment into an area, create sustainable jobs and that ecosystem I talked about that virtuous circle of jobs, investment and skills, and do it without expanding the size of the state. Because when we've done that, we've cracked it.
Perhaps we need a slogan. What do you think? Get housing done.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. I'm sure I'll see some of you in the Midland later. I'd like to thank my excellent panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with us. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. It's great fun. Cheers. Thank you for inviting me.